Hello, everybody. Welcome to another interesting and interactive session of Muskaan, an initiative of Prabhakaitan Foundation and Education for All Trust, presented by Shree Cement Limited. Prabhakaitan Foundation is an organization based in Kolkata, founded by late Dr. Prabhakaitan. The foundation is dedicated to promote performing arts, culture, education, literature, gender equality, and women's empowerment. The foundation's latest initiative, Muskaan, aims at popularizing heritage literature and culture among children and young adults by weaving it into formal and informal education through student activities. Some of the ways developed to do this are cultural programs, storytelling sessions, theater, dance, music, and art, which are organized via collaborations with our national and international associations and institutes, both in India and overseas. Today we have amongst us Mr. Ramu Damodaran, a special friend and staunch supporter of NGOs around the world, award-winning radio host and producer, as well as television news anchor. Ramu Damodaran has dedicated his life to fostering healthy and collaborative communities in India and abroad. In his position as the UN Deputy Director for Partnership and Public Engagement and the Chief of UN Academic Impact, he was responsible for countless helpful outreach and informational programs, including the UN Chronicle magazine. His earlier UN posts include Chief of Civil Society Service, the Departments of Peacekeeping and Special Political Questions, as well as the Executive Office of the Secretary General. Ramu has also held key offices as part of the Indian Foreign Service, including that of Ambassador and Executive Assistant to the Prime Minister of India. We are proud to mention that Ramu Damodaran is a well-wisher of our foundation and a long-term associate of our international activities. As you're all aware that UN Day is on the 24th of October, Mr. Damodaran will tell you about the history, structure, and the role of the United Nations. So without wasting any more time, I urge my audience to sit back, relax, and enjoy today's session. And before I hand over it to Mr. Damodaran, I would request all our viewers, all the children, all the students, and the teachers, please keep your videos on. It's very essential to keep your videos on to keep the program alive and going and more interesting. Thank you. Mr. Damodaran, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mrs. Ray. No, I was just saying that the introductory video, which Vishwa Mohan Bhatt put together, was so moving because it affirmed something which I have always believed, that India is the United Nations made possible. When you look at the diversity that short video captured, from the Kathakali dance in my home state of Kerala to the genius of Rabindranath Tagore, where many of you are in Bengal, and to the fact that India as a country and as a people have never been diffident or shy in taking the best from other cultures and adapting it to ourselves. The image of William Shakespeare that we saw. And that, in a sense, I think is really the rationale of what Mrs. Ray so eloquently described, the rationale of the Prabhakaitan Foundation, of Education for All, and certainly your newest initiative, Muskaan. I also think that the song with which the video began this evening, the song that was such a favorite of the father of our nation, Gandhiji, Ekla Chalo Re, the idea that you can go it alone. But let's remember that go it alone does not mean the individual distancing herself or himself from society. What it really means is the beginning of a journey. 100 years ago, Gandhiji started that journey, going it alone in our country. But soon, as the great lyricist and poet of our land, Majru Sultanpuri once said, others began joining him, and soon it became a caravan. So yes, going it alone is the beginning, but not the continuity or the end of the journey. And that, in many ways, is what the United Nations is all about. I don't want to talk too much about the United Nations that you may know about, have read about, or possibly even studied about. But I would like to share some thoughts with you because, as Mrs. Ray reminded us, we complete 76 years on Sunday, the 24th of October. And I really look forward to a conversation with all of you where you challenge me with your ideas of what the United Nations is or should be. But more important, you share with me your thoughts, your ideas of its possibilities. This particular United Nations Day is, to my mind, unique in several respects. We normally think of 75 as a landmark year, so 76 seems to have crossed that. But where were we on our 75th anniversary 1 year ago? We were in a world where we were frankly hiding from the world. We were in a world of complete puzzlement about the savagery of the pandemic that had hit us, the isolation it brought, the compulsions it forced upon us, the changes in every aspect of our life, including the aspect most dear to many of you, childhood, youth, education. This United Nations Day, we have come a far way forward. In our own country, we have just reached a landmark milestone in vaccination. And we have reached that even while extending friendship through vaccines to other countries less fortunate, less blessed than ours. Many years ago, Sandeep Bhutoria, a good friend, gave me this painting by Sanatan Dinda. I'm sure you recognize Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa founded a movement called Missionaries of Charity. When the United Nations started in 1945, one of the first statesmen to address it was the ambassador of Greece. And he described the United Nations as an act of charity. I want you to think of that because now sometimes when we use the word charity, we think of it as the fortunate giving to the unfortunate. There is sometimes an idea of condescension or patronage to it. But that was not the original word that was conceived, the word that the ambassador of Greece wanted to use, the word that Mother Teresa brought into our lives, the word that has inspired our vaccine Maitri to other countries. Because charity simply means the conscious desire that each one of us has something of ourselves, be it moral, be it spiritual, be it material, that we can give to someone else. And equally, we are in no ways so complete that we exclude others extending that degree of charity to us. That is the rationale of the United Nations. Think of it. It was created in 8 weeks. Countries from around the world, there were 51 countries at that time, including pre-independent undivided India. They gathered in April 1945 in San Francisco to think of an organization that could, first of all, establish a world order based on peace. Remember, the delegates that came to San Francisco, the women and men who gathered there, had in their lifetime seen 2 world wars. They had in their lifetime seen the genocide of the Holocaust. They had in their lifetime seen devastation, natural devastation, including the great famine in our country, India, or the pandemic of the Spanish flu that ravaged the world 100 years ago, towards 1918, 1920. They had seen all this and they wanted to create an organization that would simply allow countries to come together, and coming together, bring their peoples with them. So they led the caravan and the people joined. What was the structure that they envisaged for this organization? In the first place, they realized that the premise of the United Nations must fundamentally be the equality of nations, nations large and small, whether in area, in territory, or in population, or in wealth. They realized that for that you must have one body where every nation had a voice and every nation was heard. And that was the United Nations General Assembly. Many of you would have seen the news reports and coverage of the opening of this year's General Assembly on the 21st of September, just a month ago. And you would have seen at that session the President of Brazil, the first speaker, the President of the United States, the second speaker, and then a galaxy of international leaders, including our Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, all of whom came, some physically, as our Prime Minister did, some virtually because of the circumstances of our time, but every country having its opportunity to say what it considered should be important for the world and for the United Nations. So that was the General Assembly, a forum of opinion, of advice, and of action. Because once a country puts forward a proposal to the General Assembly, it becomes a resolution which is then voted upon. In some cases, it is adopted unanimously, meaning that no country objects to it. In other cases, you may have a situation where there is a vote, and if there is a majority, the resolution is adopted. Then came the second idea that the founders of the United Nations had, a much more compact body, not open to the entire UN membership, but initially to 11 members, and now to 15. The Security Council, a council which had the main or primary, but not the exclusive responsibility for international peace and security. One of the ideas that informed the Security Council was the idea of permanent members. So you had 5 countries who were present at the United Nations in 1945. The United Kingdom, the United States, China, France, and the then Soviet Union, who got together as permanent members. I don't want to spend too much time about the logic of that, because that could be a lecture or a conversation in itself. But suffice it to say that the logic of it at that time was that if we were to keep these 5 major powers of 1945 in the United Nations, you had to grant them that privilege to keep the players in the game, as they say. Today, obviously, we are not in 1945. And there is a growing movement, not only within the countries that aspire to be and should be permanent members of the Security Council, but among other countries who recognize the justice of a country like India, for instance, being a permanent member of the Security Council. And my view, my optimistic view, is that that will happen certainly in your lifetimes. And the Security Council will be enriched by having as a permanent member a country that can boast of minds like yours. Then came the question of economic and social development. And that created an Economic and Social Council, which had a responsibility to undertake studies and research going back to education. It is the Economic and Social Council that was the foundation for many of the changes we've seen in the last 76 years. The rights, the emerging rights of women, so critical to the work of the Prabhakaitan Foundation, human rights in general, the rights of children, the rights of those less abled or disabled, the creation of conventions that brought nations together. And then we had a body called the Trusteeship Council, which now no longer really functions, because this was in the world of 1945, when many colonies in the world were trust territories governed by an external power. But all those ex-trust territories have since moved on to selfhood and independence. And then we have the International Court of Justice, which is older than the United Nations itself. It's a century old, based in The Hague in the Netherlands. You may know that we have one of the judges in that court is from our country, Justice Dalbir Bhandari. And this is a court to which any country can go and challenge another country in a civil manner, not by going to war or conflict. And then finally, you had the sixth major organ of the United Nations, which is one that I had the honor and privilege to serve, the Secretariat of the United Nations, led by the Secretary General, now Antonio Guterres, the former Prime Minister of Portugal. And it's important to think of this vision of the founders, that they created the Secretariat not as serving the other organs, but an organ in itself, because this was a Secretariat that could initiate ideas. And most notably, just last month, a month ago, Antonio Guterres shared with governments around the world, with the public around the world, the results of an enormous adventure that we undertook just before the pandemic hit us, where 1.5 million people around the world share their ideas on what the United Nations should be as it approached its century in 2045. And those ideas were put into a report called Our Common Agenda, which the Secretary General launched last month. And as a possible launch to our conversation, to which I'm looking forward, I wanted to share 7 of the key ideas that the Secretary General put forward, which were really not foreseen in 1945, but which will define and be important for the United Nations, in his view, and I dare say in many of our views, in the next 25 years. The first is the idea of global governance. The United Nations is not a global government. It is a coalition, an alliance, if you will, of national governments. But there are some areas that go beyond national jurisdiction or national authority, on which we have to determine a means of global governance. What these areas are sometimes referred to are global public goods. For instance, health. How do we regulate global health while respecting national sovereignties? Or the environment. How do we protect our environment, our climate? This wonderful book of Sandeep ji, The Bera Bond, is an instance of how the biodiversity of our planet, its wildlife, its rich forestry, all of them have a certain national element to them because they are located within nations. And yet they are the heritage of humankind. And so if we can protect them through global governance and find a means to do so, the world will be so much richer for it. The second is the idea of, again, a concept which was not known in 1945, sustainable development. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, but that had a target of 2030, which is in less than 10 years from now. What happens beyond 2030? How do we really make development sustainable? How do we, in the words of the original framers of sustainable development, assure the needs of our generation, my generation, without compromising the needs of your generation, the generation that all of you represent, and which one day you will be concerned about your children inheriting? So that, again, is something which will define our next 25 years. Peace and security, the many new dangers we have, the creation of chemical weapons, of biological weapons, of drones, of cyber attacks, all unforeseen. Do we need really a new agenda for peace, which will define both the dangers that are there and dangers that may happen? The idea of artificial intelligence, for instance, which can do so much good and yet is possible of being manipulated to do so much harm. Is there a role for the United Nations in that regulation? Which brings in, of course, the whole question of digital technology. Should there be a global digital convention, a code of conduct, to prevent the misuse of the internet, of social media, for hate speech, for propagating distrust between peoples? The idea of the fact that our world is not just the planet we inhabit, but all around us, of outer space, to prevent outer space being used as a platform for future conflicts. A global regime, if you will, to coordinate and regulate space traffic. Is that something that the United Nations should do? The creation of an emergency platform. Had we had an emergency platform 2 years ago, could we have averted at least some of the devastation of COVID-19, of the pandemic? An emergency platform that goes to areas of health, of natural disaster, of gross violations of human rights and genocide. Should there be such a mechanism so that we can respond in a way that is appropriate for the 21st century? And finally, and this is an idea that Antonio Guterres has, which I think will resonate with all of you. Should the United Nations, or can the United Nations, exercise a specific responsibility for future generations, your generation? But remember, each time one of us is born, we are already the second youngest person because someone is born immediately after us. So there'll always be a future generation. But unfortunately, that is not something that the United Nations has invested too much time and thought to. And perhaps again, this is something when, at a time that the world is aging and people are living longer, the wisdom that the executing generation of our times, if you will, has, should be transferred to anticipating and understanding the needs of generations like your own. Some of you may already be involved in model UNs in your schools and campuses. I encourage all of you to think of these possibilities, to find a model UN near you, and to go into that and enrich not only your lives, but the lives of others, to go back to the true meaning of charity, by taking place or taking part in debates on issues such as this. Because the one thing that we will never be short of is the imagination, and through imagination, the wisdom that your generation possesses. And I'm looking forward to sharing some of that in your thoughts and comments. So if I may, would it be possible then now, Ms. Yadav, for me to ask you to, or Mrs. Ray, to share, ask the students to share any thoughts they have with us?
So children, as Mr. Damodaran has requested, now is the question answer session. So if there are any questions, please go right ahead. You can put it in the chat box, or you can, and then Mansi, she can unmute you and you can ask your question. Please go ahead and ask your questions, please.
Right, no, thank you. And actually, more than questions, I was going to ask for ideas, and I really would like to think of this new concept, which I just suggested, the idea of the United Nations working for future generations. Where do you, all of you who are gathered here this evening, where do you see the United Nations as an alliance of governments, if you will, playing a role in your life? What are the concerns you have? What is frightening about the future for you? So let me put that question to you. Maybe we can examine some of those ideas, and I can also learn in that process. So I'm more than happy, of course, to talk further, but I thought maybe we could throw that open and see if anyone has any thoughts or ideas on that. I may actually just share a story with you, because I may have given you the impression about this extremely large and possibly remote organization that the United Nations is. But I used to manage a program, as Mrs. Ray was kind enough to mention, called the United Nations Academic Impact. And this brought universities and research institutions around the world together, working for the United Nations. And at one level, the research was at the level of professors and scholars. But at another level, it was young minds like yourselves. And that brought home to me that when you look at the core mission of the United Nations, which is actually a very simple and beautiful phrase, it is to preserve the dignity and worth of the human person. So what does that mean? That means if your rights are not protected, your abilities not realized, your talents not fulfilled, then you do not have the full measure of your dignity or worth. And I came across a story from a student in a school, I think 14 years old, in the United States, who every Sunday used to visit his grandmother. His grandmother had failing eyesight, and she said she didn't so much mind not being able to read as much as she did earlier. She enjoyed listening to the radio or even watching television. The one thing that she found difficult was a habit she had had all her life, which is at 11 o'clock every morning to have a cup of tea. So what happened was she used to put the kettle on, put in a tea bag, and then pour the water once it had boiled. but she could never tell when the water had reached a level and she had to stop. And quite often the water spilt out of the cup, created a mess on the counter, sometimes even scalded her or burnt her hand. And she said, I just wish there was some way I could be sure of enjoying my 11 o'clock cup of tea in peace. And so this 14-year-old, his name was Tom thought of a way he could do this. And he took a cup and he put an electronic chip about just under an inch from the rim. So the moment the water reached that level, it beeped. And his grandmother knew she had to stop pouring the water.
Brilliant.
Think of that. This 14-year-old boy came up with an innovation that could help the dignity and worth of so many people around the world who are afflicted with a problem in their vision or their eyes. Tom is the United Nations. Far more than governments, far more than world leaders. His imagination, his intuition, his innovation brought about change. And I often say, we are told to think globally and act locally. In many ways, we can reverse that. Because if we think locally, if we think about changes we can bring in our families, in our homes, in our schools, in our communities, those changes can then be elevated to a global level where we act globally through the United Nations. So that that cup with an electronic chip becomes a symbol of what human ingenuity can do again as an act of charity that is not condescending, that is not superior versus inferior, but just collective in our united cause of that dignity and worth. So I'm sure amongst all of you, there are other young minds who have fashioned some solutions to problems you've come across, to situations that you've been confronted with. And if you care to share them, I'd be very grateful.
Meanwhile, there's a question here by Anjali Yadav. Her question framing, I'll just read out what she has said, about having resources being finished that are really essential for generations, just like in the case of coal recently. So probably she wants to know how is the UN going to deal with this or react to this about our diminishing resources. That is what is her question is, if I'm not mistaken. About having resources being. You want to unmute her? Anjali Yadav.
Anjali, you want to say something?
Anjali, you can say something.
Good evening, everyone. I just wanted to ask about, like, we have the resources that are being finished, that are getting replenished, and many times we can see that there are the deficiency of some resources, like just in the case of coal we had recently. So are there any major steps that the UN had taken around about the resources that are being finished, which are getting extinguished?
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Anjali. You've actually identified the problem right away. The fact that many of the engines of our development, if you will, were finite, and they were exploited without any thought of their being finite, because the then generation wanted to serve its own interest without thinking of future generations, which is why the whole concept of sustainable development, as I mentioned, is that you have to protect the rights of your generation without sacrificing the rights of future generations. What the United Nations has done is to take advantage, if you will, of the very curious fact that it is precisely those resources like coal, which you mentioned, which are being diminished, which also cause the greatest harm to human well-being and human health through their contribution to pollution. And so the solution is to create renewable resources, which will be less polluting, more sustainable, and more assured for the future. Solar energy, wind energy, hydro energy, water energy. The United Nations has an international energy agency. It has a program called Sustainable Energy for All, like the program that we are in, this Education for All. The idea being that you cannot really market resources in a way that they only go to the people who have the money to pay for it. They have to be equitable and accessible to people. And I think we would have found, even in our own experience in our own country, how much more assured we are of energy supply than we were when you were a younger child, or the stories your parents may have told you about the times of power outage and blackouts, because consciously as a nation and consciously as a world through the United Nations, we are working for sustainable and renewable energy. So it is, to my mind, a coincidence, but also a blessing, that the very resources that we are losing are the ones which it would be best for us to lose because of their impact on our health. Thank you for that.
So while children think of what to ask, sir, I had one question for you. This is keeping in mind as to what's happening in the world today, especially with, I don't know whether I'm permitted to say this, but in Afghanistan. What people were dreading, that's exactly what has happened. Although the present Taliban government has said that they're going to be inclusive and they're not going to carry out the horrors that they had done. We've read books, of the earlier Taliban regime, which have horrific tales. And it was absolutely, heartbreaking to read yesterday's news of this young sportswoman who was beheaded, I think. And so the atrocities are being carried out. Whatever is coming into the limelight, like in the newspapers, we come to know about it. But there must be several such cases happening which have not been reported. So how does the United Nations, plan to kind of protect these people?
It's a very grim and a very compelling question. The United Nations can deal with a situation like this essentially in two ways, which go hand in hand. The first is through direct and indirect diplomacy. In the case of Afghanistan, that diplomacy will have to center around governments who have a say with the government in Afghanistan. Some of its neighbors, some of the permanent members of the Security Council, and that is where the Secretariat of the United Nations and the Secretary General come in talking directly to the government in Kabul, but also dealing with other governments who may have a role there and who can play a role there, including on the very specific instances, such as the one you mentioned. The other is the humanitarian role, which goes hand in hand with diplomacy, where the United Nations humanitarian agencies, the World Food Programme, the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, can go into the country and help address some of the needs that have emerged after virtually 20 years of civil and political unrest. The second, there is hope. In August, when the situation in Afghanistan really began to unravel, it seemed as if the United Nations and its agencies would never be allowed to return there, or would not have an opportunity to work there even if they returned. That has changed. United Nations volunteers and officials and agencies are going back there. They're being welcomed there. Yes, there are restrictions, there are constrictions, but a beginning has been made. But I think, and I'm very grateful that you brought that up, Mrs. Ray, because if you look at the 76 years of United Nations history, we've had many such instances of governments and their conduct towards their peoples being something quite out of line with what the Charter of the United Nations, the dignity and worth of the human person, or simple basic human decency allows. And ultimately, in many cases, that has changed because of the spirit and the power of diplomacy and the realization by governments who might begin by saying that they can go it alone, that in this world, you just cannot. And I hope that'll happen in Afghanistan too.
Truly, we pray that it happens, because once you read and hear of such, and every day, you're kind of waiting, expecting the worst, and things are happening. It's a very, very grim situation there.
Absolutely.
So
there's one kid, Jishnu Dasgupta, who would want to ask a question, and then there's one more question, Ms. Ray, on chat box. Maybe after that.
Yes. In fact, Anjali has continued with a comment, and
good evening, everyone.
yes.
My question is, what is the part or what is the necessary action to maintain the world peace of UN?
Sorry, Jishnu, could you repeat that? What is the
necessity of the UN to maintain the world peace? That's my question.
What is the necessity of the UN?
Yes, to maintain the world peace.
To maintain world peace. Right.
To bring in world.
Again, two things. One is, it is a permanent, day-to-day alive organization where all countries are physically together, or except in the unusual circumstances the last year, but even then, countries were virtually together. So anytime that there is a danger to world peace, and Mrs. Ray referred to the situation in Afghanistan, all the countries of the world can come together and talk about it, both publicly and, more important, privately. So the idea of the UN being a forum for diplomacy is essential to world peace. The second element, which I think is very important, I'm so glad that you asked this, is that world peace, and you use the very apt word peace and not security. World peace will not be realized until every individual, every child, every woman, every man has an inner peace within herself or himself, which will only be possible if she or he has sufficient food, has good health, has an education, has rights. And these are the public goods, as I tried to suggest earlier, that the United Nations is in a position to deliver. And Jishnu, I'll just suggest one thing to you, which I think will bring this home. I talked a little while ago about sustainable development goals, which are these ideas like education, health, food. The fact that all the governments in the world, 193 governments, have agreed to these goals for things happening in their own countries shows that all 193 governments realize that the way they treat their own citizens is going to be a contribution to that global peace and to their accord with their own people. That would not have happened when I first joined the United Nations. If someone had said, what are you doing about hunger in India? I would have said, look, that is the government of India's concern. That is my country's concern. It has nothing to do with you. Today, India, like 192 other countries, is prepared to say that what happens to the human rights and to the rights to education, to food, to shelter of our people is our national, but it's also our global responsibility. And that is true of all governments. So thank you for that.
Anybody else? Any other question?
Mr. There's a question no, in the chat box. I sent it to you.
In the chat box, there is. Yeah, okay. There's a question from our teammate Prabhakaitan Foundation itself. Can the UN infringe on a country's sovereignty?
It depends again on your definition of sovereignty. There is a specific chapter in the United Nations Charter which says that the Security Council can authorize the use of force in a situation where there is an imminent threat or an established threat to world peace. So yes, the United Nations can authorize a peacekeeping force with the idea of reconciling combatants. And if that is decided upon, it would, I wouldn't say it would infringe the sovereignty, because again, you must remember that all the countries of the world have agreed to these provisions in the Charter of the United Nations and the Charter. So each government has accepted the fact that if it were to be in a situation where it is a threat to world peace, the United Nations, through the Security Council, can act against it. So in some ways, it's a bit of a philosophical conundrum whether you would call that an infringement of sovereignty. I would not. I would call it global action to a global end to prevent a threat to world peace.
Anyone else? Any other question? I can't see. Anjali Yadav has, since we have some little bit of time, Anjali has carried on with that continuation of that question of hers. Ma'am, as we can see that solar energy is a renewable resource, and also the deserts like Sahara would produce more of these energy if solar panels are placed in some areas of it. So are some steps forwarded by the UN on this base? So is the UN doing anything about, promoting renewable energy?
Yes, I mentioned the two initiatives, the SEA, Sustainable Energy for All, and the International Energy Agency, which works with the United Nations. But I think it's important, Anjali, you've also raised a very fundamental point here. The United Nations does not need to be the initiator of every global action. On the particular subject that you mentioned, the global leader is clearly our country, India. It is we who have created the International Solar Alliance. And that International Solar Alliance is now going to ask for observer status at the United Nations, precisely for the purpose that you mentioned, so that countries around the world can pool both their intellectual and entrepreneurial ability to harvest solar energy and also create bilateral platforms, including the area you mentioned, the Sahara, because many countries in the Sahara region are still technologically and economically not as developed or as advanced as other countries. So there has to be a blend of both creative solutions and financial mechanisms, which is what the Indian initiative offers. So I think it's entirely appropriate that the country that really brought Surya Namaskar to the world should now lead the global initiative on solar energy, working with the United Nations. And I'm grateful that you brought that point up, because there are so many initiatives at the United Nations that have become global because of the imagination and the proposals put forward by one country or a group of countries.
So there's another question here from Trishika. Sir, could you kindly talk about the different committees in UN such as DISEC and SOCHUM and its functions? Thank you.
Could you repeat that acronym?
DISEC. The acronym is DISEC.
Now you have me stumped there, Trishika, right? What is DISEC?
Trishika, can we?
Yes, sir. So I was asking about the Disarmament and the International Security Committee. That is the first committee of the UN.
Ah, okay, right.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. I think you made that acronym up. It's a very good acronym, but I've never heard it. I've always heard it referred to, as you said, the first committee. No, the General Assembly of the United Nations has 6 committees. The first committee, its remit, as Trishika says, is disarmament and international security. But, when I mentioned earlier, the Security Council has the primary responsibility for international peace and security, but not the exclusive responsibility. So the first committee, each of these 6 committees is comprised of all the 193 members of the United Nations. So it's really a global democracy at the working level. The first committee looks after matters relating to nuclear or conventional disarmament, peace and security. The second committee looks after economic matters and really works in tandem with the Economic and Social Council, including financial flows, including, again, issues of global aid, global debt relief. Those come within the remit of the second committee. The third committee is really the Social and Humanitarian Committee, with a particular focus on human rights, on the rights of women, on the rights of children, on basically all the rights that we need and acquire as intelligent and caring human beings. The fourth committee really began with a primary responsibility for decolonization. But as I mentioned, there were 51 countries in 1945 when the United Nations started, including India, which was then a British colony. Today, there are 193, which shows how the process of decolonization has taken place in the world. So the fourth committee is less preoccupied now with decolonization, but other issues, including, for instance, what I mentioned a little while earlier, the peaceful uses of outer space, atomic energy, specific political questions, the question of Palestine, the question of global communications. All of these have clustered together in the fourth committee. The fifth committee is the Administrative and Budgetary Committee, which works on the resources needed for the United Nations. It sets the level of financial contributions that governments or member states have to give to the United Nations. And the sixth committee is the Legal Committee, which is the source and the custodian of international law, where you have a debate on how, for instance, one thing that the United Nations has not been able to agree upon is a definition of terrorism. And this is a constant debate in the sixth committee because you need to harmonize the views of 193 governments, which is not always easy to do. But the fact that you have a forum and a mechanism to constantly discuss and think about it is itself useful. So thank you, Trishika, for allowing me to elaborate upon that.
So there are 2 more questions, but I think we're running out of time. So I'm sorry, we will have to close it now. So I'm sorry, children. I know there are 2 more questions, but we can't afford to because we are running out of time. Maybe next time. And so on behalf of the foundation, I would like to thank Mr. Ramu Damodaran for holding this session with our young listeners. I would also like to show my gratitude towards our presenter, Shree Cement Limited and Education for All Trust, Last but not the least, I would also like to show appreciation towards our young listeners. Without their enthusiasm, this session would not have been successful. In fact, towards the end, it really started warming up, and children were now coming up with questions, but I'm sorry about this. We have to cut short. Stay well, stay safe, everybody. So goodbye for now. Thank you once again, Mr. Damodaran, for this wonderful session.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful weekend.
Same to you.